This is the auxiliary remote fuel tank kit for the Champion 3100 watt generator. The kit operation is straightforward and simple. My kit comes with everything except for the fuel tank itself. The only reason I don't include the tank itself is different people are going to want a different size of fuel tank. I recommend going with the 6-gallon marine tank. They're light enough that a person can carry them around. They're readily available and they're very inexpensive. My kit comes with everything but the tank itself, and by that I do mean it includes the quick disconnect fitting to screw into the tank, the prime bulb with the hose, the fuel pump, the positive crankcase ventilation valve, the pulse port, and all the hoses and connectors that go inside the generator. Operation is very straightforward and simple. Take the fuel hose. You'll notice that the fuel hose has an arrow on it. Point the arrow in the direction of the fuel hose, which means from the tank to the generator. So you'll connect one end of the hose to the remote fuel tank. Make sure that the vent on the tank is in the open position. Take the other end of the hose, connect it to the quick disconnect on the generator. Make sure the fuel selector valve is in the off position. If you're running it off the remote tank, the fuel selector valve needs to be in the off position. If you're running it off the stock tank, move the fuel selector valve to the on position. We're going to be running it off the remote tank, so we'll put the selector valve in the off position, pump the prime bulb until it becomes firm, and you're ready to start the generator. I'm only going to run it for a couple seconds because we are inside a room and I don't want carbon monoxide building up. So let's go ahead and start the generator. Okay, pretty straightforward and simple. As I had indicated, my standard kit comes with everything except for the tank itself. And of course there are options if you wanted to go that way. You can order it without the hose or with additional fittings if you wanted additional fuel tanks. So now we'll go ahead and explain exactly how the kit is installed. First step to installing the fuel kit is going to be to go ahead and remove the access panels off of the cabinet. Then we'll remove the rear end cover off the generator. There's a Phillips head screw in the end of each handle. then a Phillips head screw on each side. You notice the ones that are in the side are longer than the ones in the handle. Then at the bottom of the end cover, there are two 10mm bolts, or excuse me, 6mm bolts with a 10mm head on them. When you go to pull the end cover off, you'll pull the bottom out and then lift straight up on it. And the hoses for the evaporative emissions container or canister are going to be holding the end cover to the generator. Those you will not remove. So we're going to let the end cover just hang right here. That way it's not in the way. The next step is going to be to remove the valve cover from the engine. To remove the valve cover, first thing is you pull the breather hose out of the end of the valve cover and pull the other end out of the air filter. It goes into this recessed hole right here in the air filter. You set this aside. You will be reusing this. The valve cover is held on with 4 more 6mm bolts with a 10mm head on each one. Next thing we're going to do is remove the PCV valve, or positive crankcase ventilation valve. We're going to be adding an external PCV valve to the system. Okay. You just hit it on the counter a couple of times and you'll start to get the inner breather plate coming away from the valve cover. And once the inner breather plate comes away from the valve cover, you can pry it out with a screwdriver like such. What we're going to do is disable this little reed valve here. The easiest way to do that is with a pair of needle nose pliers. Just simply bend it to where it now stays open. This is a stopper that keeps the breather hose from going too far in. What I do is I take and I rotate this so that the breather hose can go in as far as it wants to, because we're going to be using a different breather hose as well. So now the breather hose can go right through here, and you got a little bit more room to work with. We'll push this back into place. like so. Here's where our breather hose will go in. We'll go ahead and put this back on the engine now. The next thing we're going to do is remove the stock fuel line from the end of the fuel selector valve. You can see the fuel selector valve knob is right out here on the end, and right behind it, this bent hose is the fuel line that goes from the fuel selector valve to the carburetor. So we're going to remove this end from the fuel selector valve. Champion uses a Corbin clamp. If you've worked on Chrysler products, you're totally familiar with a Corbin clamp. It looks like this. You simply squeeze the two tabs to disengage the clamp and slide it back. And now we'll twist the hose a little bit because it's been assembled for a while, so the hose will be slightly stuck onto the end of the fuel selector valve. You see it has a formed end on it. There's a clamp right up here. If you shoot down right behind the inverter, there's a clamp that holds the fuel hose and wiring. Just open up that clamp and take this fuel hose and pull it back. It'll come out this side of the inverter module, and just leave it hanging like that till we get to the next step. The next item is the kit will come with a section of fuel hose. We're going to take this fuel hose and slide it back onto the fuel selector valve, right where the original stock hose came off. And we'll take one of the hose clamps, slide it around the hose. What I do is I squeeze it out here one click so that the hose clamp stays engaged, and then I can push it back up into place over the end of the hose where it goes onto the fuel selector valve. Hopefully you can see that on film. And once the clamp slid into place, take a pair of needle nose pliers and crimp it shut. Now look in here. And you can see the hose is crimped shut. The hose clamps work like this. What I did was I squeezed it one clamp, or one click, Then I pushed it into place. And after I pushed it up into place, I squeezed it all the way down so that it grips the hose nice and tight. And incidentally, these hose clamps can be undone. You simply slide sideways. Okay, so now we're going to take this hose and we're going to feed it right back through the same path that the stock hose used to be in. So now it'll come out over here on this side. And you want a nice smooth radius bend right at that location. And then you'll take the hose, stand over here, you can see it much better. And I'm going to put it back inside the clamp where the stock hose used to be. Okay. I just want to make sure and get that last wire that was also inside it, the stock position. Part of the idea is we want this to look as much like a factory project as possible. Now if you'll come around this side, you'll see the hose that we just put in, and look back here. The hose that we put in is going to go over the top of the stock hose. The stock hose is going to go into the side of the carburetor. Now we're going to take the fuel pump that's included in the kit and we're going to screw it in place. This is the pulse hose, and this is the fuel input hose. This is the fuel output hose, which is what goes to the carburetor. So we're going to mount the fuel pump with this hose pointing just slightly up. We're going to use the two 3/4 by 10 Phillips head screws that were included in the kit to screw it to the lid of the airbox. Now, take the original stock hose, and it has a strain relief, which is this outer sleeve. Sometimes this strain relief will be slid all the way up to here. If it is, just take the inner hose and push on the strain relief to push it as far upward as it can go toward the carburetor. Then you look at the hose and you notice it's a nice smooth bend. You don't want any kinks in the hose. Now what I'm going to do is cut the formed end off of it, because it's going to slide right on to the output of the fuel pump. So I'm going to cut it to where it's about the same amount on either side of the bend. Then I will take slide this hose and then use the stock Corbin clamp. So now this is the output of the fuel pump, and it goes to the carburetor. This is the hose that we just fitted onto the output from the fuel selector valve. We're going to run it up over the top of the airbox, and we wanted a nice, smooth, gentle curve to it. We're going to cut the hose almost even with the fuel inlet line. Okay, the next item. This is the replacement positive crankcase ventilation valve. You notice the original breather hose has a bend to it, so you will note where the end of this hose is and the end of that hose. Set them side by side and mark the original stock hose, and we're going to cut it so that the bent end can be used right here. Okay. So now we've got the end of the original stock breather line. This is going to go to the pulse port on the fuel pump in a minute. So we're going to take this, push this end into the valve cover. It will be a fairly tight fit, and that's the whole purpose. This does not have to be tight at all. This is just a breather line after here. But this takes the shock wave to run the fuel pump. A little bit easier if you put just a little bit of oil on this hose. Like I said, it is a tight fit. And now you see why I spun that inner brace that keeps you from pushing the hose in too far, because it is rather difficult to get this hose in. Once you get the hose in, so that's the end that it goes into the valve cover. That's the difficult end. Then we put the other end into the air box. And we're together. Okay. Now what I'm going to do is take the original piece of hose, put it in the kit. This is the section of hose that came with the kit. I recut it where it goes into the fuel pump. Same piece. I'm going to take it and I'm going to feed it comes out right here. And this end of it up here is going to go onto this T-fitting. So now you can see the hose. This is the pulse line. You do not need clamps on here. This hose simply carries air. It does not carry gasoline. If you would like to put clamps on here, be my guest. There are clamps included in the kit. There will be extras. Now you'll see that you have two hoses coming out here. This is the one that we cut earlier, and that's the one that runs from the fuel tank, or the fuel selector valve, to the fuel pump. This hose is the one that we just ran from the breather line. Now there's writing on the side of the hose, so you can use that as an indicator of where to cut at. Just make sure that it's a nice smooth arc, not getting in the way of anything. And I try to make it fairly long to where it arches all the way up to the top, and the top of the arch actually touches the top of the casing on the generator. And on this one right here, you can see the barb that it's going to go onto. And that's right between the L and the I on compliant. And that's where I'm going to cut it. That'll go onto here. I'm going to go ahead and make up the next section of fuel line first, because it's just a lot easier that way if we put the fuel line in place first. I'll just push this up out of the way. So on the next section of fuel line, I'm going to put the fuel T in it. So this is the section that went to the fuel selector valve. Then we're going to cut a section of hose just long enough to connect these two together. So you can see it doesn't need to be more than about 1.5 inches long. And it's going to go from here to here. Do not put it to this one. That's where the pulse line goes. I'll hold that in place and see how it looks. I'm going to shorten it just a little bit. The reason I'm going to shorten it is I don't want the hose that goes onto this end here to be kinked. I like all the hoses to be in a nice, smooth arch anywhere they go around the corner. So now you see we have our breather line, and that's the one that's attached to the fitting in the top of the valve cover. We'll hold that out of the way for a minute. We've got the hose that goes from the fuel selector valve, goes to a T-fitting, and one going into the side of the fuel pump. So I'm going to start putting hose clamps on now. Because this hose does carry gasoline. And although this is a suction line, so it's not under pressure, we don't want any risk of any gasoline leaks. In theory, if we had a leak here, what it would do is suck air in instead of leak fuel out. So now you got a fuel clamp right up next to the fuel pump. One where it comes into the T, one where the hose that comes from the fuel selector valve comes in, and then we're going to put another hose on here. Again, take the section of hose that was included. What I do is I start out running it in from that side panel, push it up onto the final portion of the T connector. Okay, so now you can see this one's in place, and we'll put a hose clamp here. Now the hose is going to come out under the valve cover area. And this is where we're going to put the fuel filter at. Now keep in mind, the fuel filter has an arrow on it, and that should be the direction of fuel flow. Since this fuel is going to flow in this direction, we're going to put the fuel filter right here. So we're going to cut the hose right at a convenient spot to where it's easy to service the fuel filter. Then put a hose clamp on the output side of the fuel filter. Put the remaining section of hose What I'm going to do is just fit it on just barely for now so I can see the layout, because this end is a lot easier to trim than the other end. Now you'll notice on the cover there's a screw hole that holds the cover onto the generator. I'm going to take a drill and I'm going to drill the hole for the fuel fitting directly under the mouth hole. You'll feel behind it there's some webbing. You may have to trim the webbing out. You can either use a 1/2 inch drill bit and then trim it when you're done, or use a step drill. if you use a step drill, just be careful not to go to the step that's slightly too large, because then your fuel fitting will rattle loose. As you come around this side, you'll see that we are going to have to trim the webbing, because that's going to keep the hose bar from seating tightly against the casing. I'm just taking the burring off of the plastic case. Making sure that this will fit in nice and snug. Okay. The kit will come with a brass hose barb. The quick disconnect fitting will screw into the hose barb like this. The kit will also include a roll of Teflon tape. Take the Teflon tape. Do not overlap the ends of the threads. You want to put it on the threads, but don't overlap the end. If you're looking at it closely, if it goes like this, that's wrong, because this can shear off, and then you'll have a piece of Teflon tape in the fuel system. There is a fuel filter that will hopefully trap all debris, but there's no point in getting more stuff in the fuel filter than you absolutely have to right from the start. Now we'll take this. That goes to the inside. keep tightening it until you feel the two pieces of brass kind of clamp down on the plastic. And there we go. It's actually a little bit loose, so I'm going to back it up one notch and tighten it down just a little bit more. Keep in mind, we don't want to go tearing the plastic or stripping the brass out. Not likely that you're going to go stripping that brass out, though. You'd have to crank down on it pretty tight to do that. Now if you look at it from this side, you can see the brass fitting, and that's where this hose is going to go. So what we're going to do is come over here, take a look at all this. Before we go hooking this up, we'll go and put our pulse line on. And as I said earlier, all this line carries is air. It does not require a hose clamp. However, if you'd like to put a clamp on it, there are extra clamps included in the kit. Make sure that the lid of your air box is completely shut. This is the snap right here. I just had to close the lid to the air box. Okay, so our breather line is in place. Now we'll take this hose that we loosely fitted over the end of the fuel filter. We're going to feed this through. So if we come around this side, you can see it actually. This hose will push onto the brass fuel filter, or fuel fitting. Then we'll put a hose clamp right here. And again, I've snapped it one click before I push it down into place, so it'll make it a little easier. And that's that. Now, we hook the top of the handle just the opposite of when we took it apart. And now our end cover is in place. We'll go ahead and put the screws on it and the two end bolts. So we'll put the two bolts in the bottom first. And the two longer screws go in the sides. And the two short ones go up into the handle. filter. And if you'll notice, this hose is longer than it needs to be, so we'll take it off where we temporarily fitted it in place. And looking at this, cutting it right here, it's going to give us about the best arc. It's not touching the engine block, and it's a nice smooth arch. We'll put one more hose clamp on the inlet side of the filter. And you will get plenty of hose and extra hose clamps with the kit. That way, if you make a mistake in one of the earlier sections, you'll have enough hose to correct it with. You'll notice that I wound up trimming off a few inches of it to throw away. I did actually have one customer who called up and said he didn't have as much hose left over when it was done. Apparently he wanted to throw away a larger piece of hose. I don't know what he was thinking. At any rate, now we'll go ahead and put oil in it and take it outside and test it. And if everything's good, then we'll put the covers on it.